The frozen earth would not yield. Each strike of the shovel was a dull thud, a sound swallowed by the vast, grey silence of the plains. Abigail felt the impact in her bones, a vibration that travelled from the iron spade, up the hickory handle, and into the hollow space where her grief had settled. 6 men took turns, their breath pluming white in the November air, their faces grim. Beside the raw gash in the ground, her brother-in-law, Franklin, stood with his arms crossed, his posture a declaration of authority over this small, sad piece of land. He watched the men work, his gaze flicking to her now and then, a look that mingled pity with impatience. Her husband, Thomas, was in the pine box. A thing she could not reconcile with the memory of his hands, calloused and warm, cupping her face just a week ago. Her dog, Barley, a great, golden creature with sorrowful eyes, pressed his body against her leg, a solid, living anchor in the disorienting cold. The preacher's words were thin, snatched by a wind that promised a bitter winter. Franklin stepped forward as the final clods of dirt fell. "It's done, Abigail. Come. Mary has soup on the stove." He spoke as if she were a child to be managed. He did not look at the grave, only at the task of her removal. She did not move. She watched the mound of displaced earth, a wound on the prairie that matched the one inside her. The other settlers began to drift away, their duty performed, their faces averted from the starkness of her new reality. A widow at 26 was a problem to be solved, a loose part in the machinery of the settlement. Franklin's boots crunched on the frost-hardened grass as he approached again. "There is nothing more to see here. The land will be sold. You'll come live with us." It's the only sensible thing. His words were not a suggestion. They were the laying of a track she was expected to follow. She finally looked at him, her eyes dry. The fire of her grief had burned away all her tears. She shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible motion. Barley growled low in his chest, a sound Franklin chose to ignore. The cabin was a vessel of absence. Every object held the ghost of Thomas's touch, the worn handle of the water pump, the chair he built that sat empty by the cold hearth, the faint scent of sawdust and sweat that clung to his wool coat hanging on a peg. Abigail moved through the silence, her hands tracing the lines of their brief life together. Barley followed, his tail low, his paws silent on the wooden floorboards. He would stop and sniff at a spot, a phantom scent only he could detect, then look up at her with a profound, questioning sadness. The quiet was broken by the sharp rap of a fist on the door. It was Franklin, as she knew it would be. He entered without waiting for an invitation, his presence filling the small room, his certainty sucking the air out of it. "I've spoken to the land agent," he began, wasting no time on comfort. "He believes we can get a fair price, considering the season. We'll need to clear out Thomas's things." He gestured vaguely at the room, at the life contained within it. "Most of it is junk. That shed he wasted all summer on, for instance. A pile of rust. We'll burn it." Abigail stood by the window, looking out at the structure in question. It was small, ugly, its corrugated iron roof already streaked with oxidation. Thomas had worked on it with a singular focus, ignoring the neighbors' questions and Franklin's open ridicule. He called it his folly, she said, her voice quiet. He had his reasons. Franklin snorted, a sound of pure condescension. Thomas had notions, Abigail. Not reasons. A man with a family to feed doesn't spend his days digging in the dirt for secrets. Now, Mary has made up the spare room for you. You can help her with the mending. It will be a respectable life. He was offering her a cage disguised as a sanctuary. She would be a dependent, a spinster aunt before her time, her life shrinking to the size of a sewing basket. She turned from the window. Her gaze was level. "I am not leaving." Franklin's face tightened. The mask of familial concern slipped, revealing the steel of his will. "Do not be a fool. A woman alone cannot work this claim. The winter will kill you, if loneliness doesn't first." This is not a choice, but it was. After he had gone, leaving a trail of threats and ultimatums in the cold air, she found it. A single, heavy iron key on a leather thong, tucked inside Thomas's worn Bible, marking a passage in Ecclesiastes about a time for every purpose under heaven. A small, crudely stamped metal tag was attached to the key. It bore one word, shed. The lock was stiff with rust and cold. It took both her hands, her whole body straining against the iron, before the mechanism finally turned with a painful, grinding screech. The door swung inward on protesting hinges, opening into a space that smelled of damp earth, metal, and something else, the faint, clean scent of pine resin. The interior was not the cluttered mess Franklin had predicted. It was an armory of purpose. Tools hung in meticulous order, shovels with sharpened blades, a heavy pickaxe, a sledgehammer, lanterns with full wicks and polished glass. Sacks of lime and cement were stacked neatly against one wall. But the heart of the shed was the square-cut hole in the center of the packed dirt floor. A thick trapdoor of reinforced planking lay flush with the ground, a heavy iron ring set into its surface. Barley whined, sniffing at the edges of the door, his unease a palpable thing. Abigail knelt, her fingers tracing the rough wood. This was the folly. This was the secret. She hooked her fingers through the ring and pulled. The door was immensely heavy, a dead weight that fought her with sullen inertia. She set her feet, bent her knees, and put her back into it, a grunt escaping her lips. It lifted, revealing not a shallow pit, but a set of steep, narrow steps descending into absolute darkness. She lit one of the lanterns. The flame cast a warm, dancing light, pushing back the gloom. She held it over the opening. The light revealed walls of dense, packed soil, braced with thick timbers. The space was small, no more than 10 feet deep and 10 feet square, but it was solid. It was safe. Pinned to one of the timber braces was a sheaf of cured leather scraps. On them, in Thomas's neat, architectural hand, were drawings. A plan. He hadn't just been digging a hole. He had been constructing a shelter, a subterranean room connected to the cabin by a tunnel he had only just begun. There were diagrams for a ventilation shaft, a clever chimney flue that would draw smoke from a small stove, and deep shelves for storing food. It was a storm cellar, a root cellar, a winter fortress. A place to survive. She looked at the drawings, at the careful measurements and notes, and the full weight of his love settled over her. He had not been wasting time. He had been trying to save her. He had seen the hard winters coming. He had known. A new fire began to burn in her chest, a clean, hot flame that cauterized the edges of her grief. She picked up a shovel. Her inheritance was not a piece of land to be sold. It was a blueprint for survival, a legacy of labor. The work was a brutal catechism, teaching her the limits of her own body. The first day, she dug for hours, the rhythmic scrape and thud of the shovel a conversation with the earth. By nightfall, her back was a knot of fire, her palms were raw, and a tremor had taken root in her arms. She collapsed onto her cot, too tired to eat, and slept a dead, dreamless sleep. Barley, her silent shadow, licked the dirt from her face in the morning and laid his head on her chest until she stirred. She rose with the sun, her muscles screaming in protest, and returned to the hole. Each shovelful of earth was an act of defiance. She was not a helpless widow to be managed, she was a builder. She was not burying herself in grief, she was digging her way through it. The physical pain was clarifying. It crowded out the memories, the what-ifs, the hollow ache of loneliness. There was only the immediate reality of the soil, the dense, damp clay near the surface, the layer of frustrating gravel that had to be broken with the pickaxe, the rich, dark loam beneath. She learned the language of the ground, its moods and textures. In the evenings, by the light of the lantern, she studied Thomas's drawings, his notes becoming her gospel. She mixed cement in a wheelbarrow, her movements clumsy at first, then more certain, packing it into the gaps in the timber bracing as he had instructed. She remembered him coming in from the shed, his hands caked with mud, a look of quiet satisfaction on his face. He had tried to explain it to her once. "The earth has its own heat, Abby," he'd said, his voice soft. "Go down deep enough, and it doesn't know winter from summer. It holds a steady temperature. It keeps things safe." She hadn't understood then. She had seen only the dirt under his nails, the exhaustion in his eyes. Now, his wisdom was a tangible thing, a shelter rising around her from the very ground he was buried in. Word of her strange labor spread through the settlement. Riders would pass by, slowing their horses to stare at the growing mound of earth beside the rusty shed. Franklin's wife, Mary, sometimes came, standing at the edge of the property with a basket in her hands, a worried frown on her face. She never approached, but her silent, watchful presence was a question Abigail had no time to answer. She was too busy working. She was too busy surviving. The first snows came not as a gentle blanket but as a sharp, stinging flurry, a scout for the army of winter massing on the horizon. The wind developed a new edge, a razor-honed keenness that sliced through her wool coat and chilled her to the bone. The ground hardened, and the digging became a battle. Each swing of the pickaxe sent a jarring shock up her arms. The work was slower, harder, but more urgent. She had finished the main chamber and was now carving out the tunnel that would connect the shelter to the cabin cellar, a cramped, claustrophobic passage where she had to work on her hands and knees. It was in the middle of this task, covered in dirt and sweat despite the freezing air, that Franklin returned. He stood at the top of the steps, a dark silhouette against the bleak, grey sky, his face a mask of disbelief and anger. "In God's name, Abigail, what is this obsession?" he boomed, his voice echoing in the subterranean space. "You look like a grave robber. The whole settlement is laughing at you." Thomas's mad widow, digging her own tomb, she paused, resting her shovel against the earthen wall, and looked up at him. The lantern light cast shadows across her face, making her eyes seem deep-set and ancient. She did not feel shame. She felt a profound and weary calm. "I'm busy, Franklin," his face flushed with color. "Busy? You are disgracing his memory. You are making a spectacle of yourself and of this family. I will not have it. I am taking you back to my house now, and we are done with this madness." He started down the steps, his hand outstretched as if to haul her out. Barley, who had been sleeping in a corner, rose to his feet, a low, guttural warning rumbling in his chest. The dog placed himself between Abigail and Franklin, his teeth bared. Franklin froze, his eyes widening. He had always seen Barley as a simple farm dog, he had never seen the protector that lived beneath the placid exterior. Abigail placed a calming hand on the dog's back. "He stays." Her voice was quiet, but it held the unyielding density of bedrock. "And so do I." Franklin stared at her, then at the dog, then at the evidence of her labor all around him, the neatly stacked jars of preserves on a new shelf, the small wood stove waiting to be installed, the stubborn, unshakable resolve in her eyes. He saw none of it as prudence, only as insanity. "You will die down here," he hissed, backing up the steps. "And I will not be the one to bury you." He turned and left, the sound of his horse's frantic gallop swallowed by the rising wind. The storm did not arrive, it fell. It was as if the sky, heavy and bruised for days, simply broke open. The world beyond her small cabin window disappeared behind a solid, vertical wall of driving snow. The wind was no longer a sound, it was a physical presence, a malevolent entity that slammed against the walls and clawed at the roof. The cabin, which had always felt so sturdy, now seemed a fragile, wooden shell. It groaned and shuddered with each new assault. Timbers creaked in protest, and the glass in the single window rattled a frantic, desperate rhythm. Abigail lit every lantern she had, but the light seemed thin and weak, unable to penetrate the oppressive, roaring darkness that pressed in from all sides. Barley paced, his claws clicking on the floorboards, his body tense, a low whine perpetually caught in his throat. He would press against her, then move to the door, then to the trap door leading to the cellar, his instincts screaming that this wooden box was a trap. The temperature plummeted. A fine, glittering powder of snow began to blow through invisible cracks in the walls, coating every surface with a layer of frost. The fire in the hearth spat and hissed as the wind forced its way down the chimney, sending puffs of acrid smoke into the room. This was the test. This was the winter Thomas had foreseen. She knew the cabin would not hold. Franklin's proud, two-story house might withstand this, but her small, humble home was at the mercy of the storm's full fury. She did not panic. Her movements were deliberate, honed by weeks of purposeful labor. She gathered the essential supplies, the remaining lanterns, a sack of dried meat and biscuits, the heavy wool blankets from her bed. She opened the trap door to the small cellar, then the new, rough-hewn door to the tunnel she had finished only days before. The air that greeted her from the tunnel was still, cold, but silent. It was the silence of the deep earth. "Come on, boy," she said, her voice calm. Barley needed no encouragement. He scrambled ahead of her into the darkness. She followed, pulling the heavy cellar door closed behind her, plunging them into absolute blackness for a moment before she lit the lantern in her hand. She crawled through the narrow passage and emerged into the dugout. Down here, the storm was a distant, muffled roar, the rage of a forgotten world. The earth held them, safe and silent in its cold, steady embrace. She lit the small stove, and a fragile, precious warmth began to fill the chamber. Above them, the world was tearing itself apart. Below, there was peace. The silence was the first sign. A deep, profound stillness that felt heavier and more absolute than the noise it replaced. Abigail woke from a light sleep, the small stove still radiating a gentle warmth. Barley lay beside her, his breathing slow and even. The storm had passed. She climbed the steps, her muscles stiff, and put her shoulder to the shed's door. It wouldn't budge. She pushed harder, a flicker of fear touching her, until she realized it was simply the immense weight of snow piled against it. She found the shovel she'd left inside and began to dig her way out from the top of the steps, pushing snow back into the dugout until she could force the door open a crack. The light that sliced through the opening was blinding, a pure, painful white. She squeezed through the gap and stood, blinking, in a transformed world. The prairie was gone, buried beneath a sculpted landscape of white. The snow was piled in immense drifts, carved by the wind into waves and crests, some as high as the cabin's roof. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, a cruel mockery of the devastation below. She looked toward her cabin. A huge section of the roof over the main room had been torn away, leaving a gaping wound open to the sky. The interior was filled with snow, the furniture overturned and buried. It was a ruin. Had she stayed there, she would have frozen. A deep, shuddering breath escaped her. Thomas had saved her. His foresight, his folly, had been her salvation. She scanned the valley. Smoke rose from only a few chimneys. Most homes were dark, half-buried shapes in the snow. Then she saw it. Franklin's house, the largest and proudest in the settlement, stood wounded on its hill. The grand, steep-pitched roof that he had boasted of, built with expensive lumber shipped from the east, had failed. A huge section had collapsed inward, leaving the second story exposed like a broken dollhouse. The sight brought her no triumph, only a dull, aching sorrow for the foolishness of pride. Wood and height, the things men valued, had proven fragile. Earth and depth, the things they had mocked, had endured. She looked at the thin column of smoke rising from her own hidden chimney pipe, a defiant signal of life from beneath the frozen earth. He came at dusk, a trudging, dark figure against the endless snow. He was not alone. His wife, Mary, followed a few paces behind, her face wrapped in a shawl, and she held the hand of their small son, Peter. Franklin was not the man who had last stood in her dugout, bellowing with arrogance. This man was diminished, his shoulders slumped, his face grey with exhaustion and cold. The wind had stripped him of his pride. He stopped a few feet from where she stood, clearing a path to the shed, his gaze fixed on the wisp of smoke rising from the simple iron pipe. He looked at the ruined cabin, then back at the smoke, the two facts warring in his mind. He did not seem to know how to begin. Barley, sensing no threat, sat calmly at Abigail's side, his tail giving a slow, tentative thump against the snow. Mary's eyes, wide and fearful, met Abigail's over her husband's shoulder. It was the wife who held the family's terror, while the husband held its shame. The boy, Peter, was the only one who seemed unafraid. He stared with wide, curious eyes at the entrance to the shed, a mysterious door in a hill of white. Finally, Franklin spoke, his voice a rough, broken thing. "We saw your smoke." It was not an apology. It was not a request. It was a simple statement of fact, heavy with all the things he could not bring himself to say. His house was ruined. His family was cold. His certainty was shattered. He, the man who knew everything, had been wrong about everything. He, who had offered her a cage of dependent safety, now had no shelter of his own. Abigail looked at his son, whose small face was pinched and blue with cold. She looked at Mary, who was shivering visibly. She looked at Franklin, a man humbled not by her, but by the indifferent power of the sky and the earth. There was no victory in it. There was only the harsh reality of survival. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not remind him of his mockery or his rage. The earth had already taught him the lesson far better than she ever could. She simply stepped aside from the path she had cleared and gestured with her head toward the open door of the shed. The invitation was unspoken, but clear. Come in from the cold. Come down into the safety of the ground. The warmth of the dugout was a physical shock after the biting cold outside. It was a dense, living warmth, smelling of hot iron, burning pine, and the clean, mineral scent of the earth itself. Franklin, Mary, and Peter descended the steps into the lantern-lit space, their eyes wide. This was no badger's den, no crude hole. It was a room. A functional, organized, life-sustaining space. Shelves Thomas had designed were loaded with jars of food. Blankets were neatly folded on a low cot. The small stove glowed with a comforting red-orange heat. It was a testament to a wisdom Franklin had been too proud to see. He stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, taking it all in. He was a trespasser in the sanctuary he had condemned. He looked at the smooth, packed earth walls, the heavy timber braces, the ingenious ventilation shaft that kept the air fresh. He saw not madness, but a profound and humbling logic. Mary, wasting no time on pride, began to chafe her son's hands, her relief so palpable it was almost a sound. Abigail handed her a spare blanket, and their hands brushed, a brief contact of shared understanding. The boy, Peter, recovered first. His childish curiosity overcame the strangeness of the situation. He saw Barley lying by the stove and, after a hesitant glance at his mother, went to him, burying his small, cold fingers in the dog's thick, warm fur. Barley sighed and rested his head on the boy's lap. The simple act of trust broke the tension in the room. As Abigail prepared a stew from dried venison and potatoes, a new sound reached them from above, shouting, faint and desperate. Soon, another family appeared at the entrance, their faces etched with fear and cold, drawn by the impossible smoke. Then another. By full dark, her dugout held 3 families, the dispossessed of the storm. The children huddled around Barley, their fear forgotten in the presence of the warm, patient animal. The women helped Mary and Abigail, their quiet, efficient movements a testament to a shared, unspoken pact. The men, Franklin among them, were silent, their authority rendered meaningless. They were guests, saved by the foresight of a man they'd called a fool and the labor of a woman they had pitied. Sometime late in the night, Franklin picked up a spare shovel. He went up the steps and, without a word, began to widen the path, clearing the snow for anyone else who might be lost in the darkness. Years passed. The seasons turned, each bringing its own trials and blessings. The Great Blizzard became a landmark in the settlement's memory, a harsh lesson etched into the community's soul. The rusty shed was gone, replaced by a proper stone entrance, and the dugout itself had been expanded. It was no longer just Abigail's shelter, it was the town's. Each autumn, before the first snow, the men of the valley gathered there for a new kind of harvest. They did not bring in wheat or corn. They brought lumber to reinforce the tunnels, lime to whitewash the walls, and wood for the great stove that now sat in the expanded main chamber. Franklin was always among them. The storm had not broken him, it had remade him. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady competence. He never spoke of that winter, but his actions were a constant, living apology. He listened more than he spoke, and when he looked at Abigail, it was with a deep, abiding respect that was worth more than any spoken amends. Abigail never married again. She had found a different kind of partnership, a communion with the land itself. Her homestead became a place of learning. Young women came to her not for lessons in sewing, but to learn how to read the sky, how to preserve a harvest, how to understand the deep, slow rhythms of the earth. She taught them not with words, but by example, her calloused hands a testament to the power of self-reliance. One cool evening in late summer, she stood at the entrance to the shelter, Barley beside her. The dog was old now, his muzzle frosted with grey, his movement slow and deliberate. But his eyes, when he looked at her, were as loyal as ever. She looked out across the valley, at the fields golden with ripe wheat, at the sturdy homes with their stone foundations and sensible roofs. She saw the children playing in the twilight, their laughter carrying on the gentle breeze. Her life was not the one she had imagined with Thomas, but it was a good life, a full one. He had left her more than a shelter, he had left her a purpose. He had given her a key, and with it, she had unlocked not just a door in the earth, but a strength in herself she never knew she possessed. The community had been saved not by the pride of its strongest men, but by the quiet defiance of a widow who had listened to the wisdom of the ground beneath her feet.